Hello everyone, my name is Micaela, I'm a customer education specialist, and we are going to talk about advanced reconciliation. In the Universal Reconciliator, in this version 1.0, we are going to introduce what we call advanced reconciliations. The first version we release, this will be labeled as data. But what are advanced reconciliations? If you look at the sidebar, there are reconciliations as they exist today, as a resource, as a configuration. They will continue to function as you are used to. However, these advanced reconciliations will be a new type of configuration or resource. What is involved in these advanced reconciliations? Well, after reviewing and understanding different use of cases and the configurations that our clients, you as a user and a customer, implement within the application, we realized that we needed to introduce a new type of configuration with more capabilities. This new configuration should be able to handle multiple processes that today need to be done in separate steps. Currently, there are long configuration and complex sequences. First, you need to configure one part, then use the result to compare against a grouping, and then obtain the disaggregated details of that group. Today, you need to create multiple reconciliations along the way to achieve this. The goal of advanced reconciliations is to consolidate all these cases into a single configuration. So I will go over the theoretical elements, explaining the concepts clearly so that we can understand what happens in the system when an advanced reconciliation is executed or configured. After that, we'll move into a demo. I have a small case to show you directly within the product. So let's compare the standard flow, the reconciliations you already know, within the new reconciliation flow. It's like having all the sweeps in a single screen at once. Sweep 1 with their own rules, sweep 2 with their rules. In the new configuration flow, we go sweep by sweep. Why? Because we have different type of sweeps. Thus, within the standard process, there are only reconciliation sweeps. I am simply comparing A to B, considering columns from A, columns from B, and the criteria for matching them. Meanwhile, in the new configuration, we will have two types of sweeps. We will have the reconciliation sweeps. We are on side I, where I will search for the records on the other side based on matching criteria. But we also have the compensation sweeps, which means that within the same resource, I will look for matches within that same source. This is also known as zero effect. In the new configuration, in the new reconciliation process, we will have the same logic, but we will also introduce a grouped logic. What does group logic imply? It means that I can configure a calculation instructing the system to first take these records, group them, and once they are grouped, then attempt to find a match on the counterpart or even within itself for a compensation or zero effect. The idea is that compensation sweeps eliminate the need to create an intermediate reconciliation that currently serves this function, as well as the need for grouped calculation sweeps. The idea is to eliminate the need for manually taking sources, grouping them, and performing reconciliations in separate states, one for detail to detail and other for detail to grouped. Instead, this logic can now be incorporated directly within the same configuration. Type of matching: in the current reconciliations, we have one-to-one, end-to-end, end-to-one, and one-to-end matching types. Meanwhile, the new configuration follows a one-to-one approach. A record can be reconciled only once against another, even if it's grouped. If it is grouped, multiple records reconcile against one. But this is because the aggregation of those records meets the matching criteria with respect to the other. Do's and don'ts. What can and cannot be done with these first advanced reconciliations? This is a new type of reconciliations that does not affect the previous ones in any way. Users can continue using the existing reconciliations without any issues. You can reconcile sources, union of sources, source opening and the current reconciliations can still be reconciled. However, advanced reconciliations cannot be used as inputs for other advanced reconciliations. Why? Because the purpose of advanced reconciliations is to eliminate the need for chaining multiple configurations together. Instead, all those configurations can now be applied at once. Additionally, we keep in all configurations within a single reconciliation. The process performs much better than a chain of reconciliations would in achieving a final result. Additionally, by keeping all configurations within a single reconciliation, the process performs much better than a chain of reconciliations would in achieving a final result. We will have the standard actions such as unmatch and reverse adjustments. In the version 1.1, we'll introduce manual reconciliation, which will be available around February 18th. Version 1.2 will include manual compensation, manual zero effect, expect between March and April. There is an important point here. A new column will be introduced, identified as the hash ID. This column indicates the group of transactions that matched. It will now show you why this column is crucial when interpreting the results. When dealing with the group sweeps, we can group both sides of the reconciliation, group only one side, or not group at all, which would work as reconciliations do today. Chain columns cannot be added because there is no chaining element, as the entire sequence is meant to be a configuration in itself. Groupings cannot be used within advanced reconciliations. Why? Because advanced reconciliations already allow grouping to find matches. Additionally, advanced reconciliations cannot be used to create another advanced reconciliations or to generate all or existing reconciliations, so to speak. This is very important. The idea of these advanced reconciliations is that they should be the final step of the configuration. I perform by enrichment processes with the sources, create my union of source, do the once-to-many reconciliations to enrich the data, and finally, I generate my advanced reconciliation, which incorporates all the logic I need to close the control. So, grouped sweeps. This is how the interface looks. We will see it directly within the application shortly. Essentially, I enter, choose grouping criteria and aggregation values of criteria, such as sum, count, etc. It will show me that it's grouped, and then I can select the matching rules. No extra grouping is created, no resource or aggregated databases is generated. What happens is that when the reconciliation is executed, when that sweep runs, it first performing the group calculations. Once grouped, it goes to find the match. If no match is found, nothing happens. It simply undoes the grouping and continues with the calculation for the next sweep. What the system will try to do is take the database, and if that sweep is grouped, it will group those records and try to find a match on side B or side A. I can group side A, side B, or both. That covers group sweeps. Now let's talk about compensation sweeps. Look at the interface. When we enter, the system will ask us what type of sweep we want to create, reconciliation or compensation. If we choose compensation, we will be working with that we call compensable groups, which are quite different from reconcilable groups. It's an important distinction. The compensable group is about how we partition data when looking for a zero effect match. Essentially, how do we structure our data to find these compensation pairs? Or one more than one pair? Because I can also use, for example, group calculation criteria in these cases. The clearest example is that I take the column, let's say transaction type, and it turns out that the transaction type separates the same databases in 2 or 3 groups: credits, debits, and chargebacks. And compensation makes sense to happen between credits and debits. So I separate credits from debits, which are part of the same side. And then I select the matching criteria to achieve, let's say, that zero effect and ensure the transactions are netted. Conceptually, What would be happening is that the same database would be separated into groups, one for credits and the other for debits. And by making this separation, I then apply the matching rules. The credit and debit must then have the same 4 digits of the cards, the same acquired, the same brand, and the same amount. But I already know that one is credit and the other side is debit. And that's where the effect zero comes. So to speak, the net effect comes into play. And well, this is how they would look. Conceptually, the results are displayed under those colors to make them much more evident. And this is where the hash ID, an important component, comes into play. For example, what does the sweep mean? These 4 blue records on side A reconcile with these blue records on side B. So this is a group sweep where side A is group and side B is not. If I sum the amounts, 100% plus 8090 plus 2,140 plus 1,08070, it will get the 5,000. So this code that we are calling external and this amount we are calling authorization code, they are matching rules here. So here's how it will look. Records reconcile through group sweeps. Similarly, in yellow, another group suite will appear, but in this case, both A and B are grouped. 2 records from A reconcile against 2 records from B, but the reconcile is a group manner. 100 plus 150 is 250, and 200 plus 50 is 250. So there is an aggregation criteria. They have the same external code. Let's say this same code is the same. And by adding the values, that's where the match is. 2 against 2, but not necessarily 1 to 1, and the other with the other, which would be, for example, this sweep 3, right? This is how we present the results today in the current reconciliations. It's one matching with one from the other side. So they appear side by side because it's an exact match. In the other cases, we're talking about group match. And this last sweep will be a compensation sweep, where this record from A, this cell compensates, or has a zero effect, a net effect with this return. And then we have that compensation. There is no information from B because what is being compensated, the match is found in A. The status for what compensate will be offset. So now we'll have a reconcile, offset, and a reconcile status. The hash ID is important because it is now the column that groups the records that are part of the same batch that reconciled, and that group itself is a match. So now we move to this point. The configuration is once again side A and side B. Here I go into advanced reconciliations, select the side, and choose the reconcilable group, which is a subset of the information to be reconciled. We configure sweeps, and when we enter sweep configurations, we see this interface. When I add a sweep, the system asks whether it's a reconciliation sweep or a compensation sweep. What do you want to do in this case? And replicating a bit of what we saw here in the presentation, this same example is as follows. We have sweep 1, which is a group sweep, where side A is group and side B is not. The group calculation I have here is group by this column called external and sum the amount. And once the calculation is done, compare it externally against the code and ensure the amount is equal. It's a pretty simple configuration. I save the sweep and then continue with the next one. Now we have the second sweep, the yellow one. So on this side, I have both sides, A and side B, grouped. In both cases, I select the criteria by which I'm grouping, as well as the value I'm aggregating, right? And I generate the matching criteria. Done. Now I move to sweep 3, which is the case it's a simple sweep, meaning a one-to-one match between side A and side B, which is what we know today. In this case, they are not group calculations. These matching rules simply needs to be fulfilled. And in sweep 4, we have a compensation. In a compensation, I select which side I want to compensate and configure what is compensable group. In this case, I say I want net returns with sales, right? So if I returned and the sales have the same amount, they have a compensate. Then I save the sweep. Once this is done, I'll show you this, which is before confirming the calculation and execution of these sweeps. We already have the result. The hash ID column is important because those sharing is the same hash ID are part of that batch, which is precisely, so to speak, this result. 4 records from A reconciles again 1 record from B. Here we have the 5 records from the same hash ID in reconcilable status, referring the group sweep 1, and here we have the records from A against the records from B. Here is also the records from A, those 4 records from A against this record from B, where the sum of these gives me 5,000. The next one is group sweep number 2, where 2 records from A reconciles again 2 records from B. Here are the 4. They share the same hash ID. The simple sweep is a 1-to-1 match from A to B. And on the open side, the compensate one is a 1-to-1 match from A to A. They share the same hash ID, where this return matches this cell with the same amount. So I confirm this. I confirm these reconciliations and the result. And once it's confirmed, I'll go to the spreadsheet where I have the actions I mentioned, like creating columns, making adjustments, reversing adjustments, and performing unmatching. Recommendation on sweeps. Always try to make the most robust sweeps the first ones. And then if you start adding tolerance elements, place them in the sweeps lower down in the order. Precisely because, and as I just mentioned before, the system executes them in order. So if we set a sweep to something very loose, anything could match with anything. However, if I ensure strong matches in each sweep, I can be confident that as I start adding tolerance levels, the probability of no match becomes lower and lower, because what I needed to match has already matched. As I mentioned, manual reconciliation will have a very similar interaction to what we already have today, but with a more user-friendly UI, and we're also adding a bit more aesthetics to the process. The same goes for adjustments. We will have the option to adjust and reserve records. And as of February 18th, we are talking about manual reconciliation, which is similar to what we have today for current reconciliations, but improvement with a clear interface. And we also know that sometimes having all this information with its certain screen sizes can be limiting. So specifically for manual reconciliations, I will be able to place spreadsheets side by side or one below the other to make the comparisons I need to make. So here, the adjustment functionality comes into play again. There has to be a filter applied, in this case in the API. The uncompensated functionality will also be available, meaning that we can't change records from offset status back to the unreconciled. In this case, an automatic compensation didn't result in what we expected, an unreconciled, which means changing records from reconciled to unreconciled. It's a pretty important and large feature, and honestly, our goal is to change the way use cases are configured. No, puta, hice una larga pausa al pedo. Para. 3, 2, 1, va. It's a pretty important and large feature, and honestly, our goal is to change the way use cases are configured, providing providing much more versatility. As I mentioned, this will help you a lot. We've also replicated internally with use cases we've studied. It greatly helps reduce configuration time because no sé lo que me pasa. It greatly helps reduce configuration times because I no longer need to create long chains, but instead, Dios. It greatly helps reduce configuration time because I no longer need to create long chains, but instead I use, oh, no, I just need to understand the logic of the sweeps that should be applied and it was in... No, 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 no puedo hablar, no puedo hablar, no puedo hablar, no puedo hablar. Voy a voltar de celo. It greatly helps reduce configuration times because I no longer need to create long chains, but instead, I just need to understand the logic of the sweeps that should be applied and in what order. And this is all done in a single configuration. I have many levels of editing that I didn't have when creating those chains. And at any time, I can create a version with changes and modify the way calculations are done. I can adjust the group criteria, compensation criteria, and reconciliation criteria. I can add new sweeps or remove something that might no longer follow the appropriate business logic. And well, if I already have a productive case with a long chain, it was extremely difficult to make those changes. It was very rigid structure, so they give us that versatility. The invitation is to use it, especially with the most complex use cases, to start exploring it and to share with us how it has been, how you've been to experience, no, to experience this. Puta, para vamos de vuelta. The invitation is to use it, especially with the most complex use cases, to start exploring it and to share with us how it has been, how you begin to experience this. And I would say try to address all those use cases that are chains. I have one source and then what's left from one is reconciled with another and what's left against another and so on. I would suggest creating a union for all of this. And with that source and the advanced reconciliations, the complexity of that configuration will likely be significantly reduced, and we will also have something that performs much better.